Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Wednesday webcast. I'm going to just get started while people are joining and kick it off here, and then we'll have maximized time for our presenters tonight. So, hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us for our webcast, The Hidden Toll of Roads, Protecting Wildlife in a World of Highways. My name is Danielle Moser, and I'll be your MC for tonight. I'm the Wildlife Program Manager for Oregon Wild. We are a state-based conservation organization that works to protect and restore Oregon's wildlands, wildlife, and waters. And this year is actually our 50th anniversary. I'm honored to introduce our very special guest, Ben Goldfarb. Ben is an environmental journalist whose work has appeared in National Geographic, The Atlantic, Smithsonian Magazine, and many other publications. He is the author of Crossings, How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet, named one of the best books of 2023 by the New York Times. And then after Ben's presentation, we'll hear from my esteemed colleague, Rob Clavins, Oregon Wild's Northeast Field Coordinator, about his efforts to protect the beautiful Eastern Oregon, which includes the Blue Mountains. So before I turn it over to them, I would like to take a moment to offer gratitude to the land itself and for those who've lived in Oregon since time immemorial. I would also like to acknowledge the continuing presence of Indigenous peoples on the land today. The history of tribes in Oregon is complex and nuanced and includes many colonial legacies and wrongdoings like forced removal that have had long-lasting and current impacts. It is important to not only acknowledge Indigenous people and land, but continue to do meaningful work by supporting them in the present, respecting and uplifting tribal sovereignty, and taking action. So please visit our website for additional educational resources and ways to get engaged and support that important work. If you're interested in watching this webcast again or want to share it with family and friends, we will have a recording of this program, which will be emailed out this week and will be posted on our website, oregonwild.org. And then finally, please enter your questions at any time in the Q&A section. We usually get a flood of questions right at the end, so the sooner you can get it in, the easier it is for me to organize and answer them. So after Ben, we'll have Rob, and then we'll get to those questions and answer. And if we have quite a few questions, we'll hang on a little bit past the hour to get those questions answered. So with that, I'll stop sharing, and Ben, turn it over to you. Oh, you're still on mute, Ben. There you go.
Wow, you would think that after 4 years of Zoom, I would know to unmute myself. But anyway, what I did say was thank you so much for that introduction, Danielle, and thanks to all of you for being here this evening. I live in Colorado these days, but I wrote a lot of this book while living in Spokane. So I'm always happy to be addressing audiences based in the Northwest. So this conversation tonight and the book that kind of predicated it is about road ecology. And I don't know if that's a term that's familiar to most of you, but basically road ecology is this relatively small but fast growing field of science that looks at all of the many different ways that roads shape and transform nature. And I think really importantly, what we can do to manage and mitigate all of those negative interactions that roads and ecosystems and wildlife have. And roads are so transformative in large part because there are just so many of them, right? We have something like 4 million miles of road here in the US. There are around 40 million miles of road around the world. And there are something like 15 million miles more that are being built now, essentially. We're in the middle of this period that scientists have called the infrastructure tsunami, this wave of new construction sweeping the planet. So we've got a lot of roads and we're building a lot more all the time. And I think in part because roads are so ubiquitous, we don't really notice them or think about them very much. We just kind of use them every day and take them for granted. And when we do think about roads, we think about them in fundamentally positive terms, right? Roads are really useful. You know, they're how we get to schools and grocery stores and trailheads and all the fun things we like doing. And, you know, in the US especially, they have this powerful cultural significance. You know, the open road is this symbol of freedom and mobility and momentum, which is somewhat ironic because for all of the freedom that roads provide human beings, they deny and curtail wild animals that same ability to move around the landscape at a truly mind-boggling scale. And of course, the most conspicuous, obvious way that roads do that is through roadkill, right? Wildlife vehicle collisions. And the number of animals that are killed by cars is I think pretty mind blowing. Often when I'm addressing live audiences, I ask them, how many animals do you think are killed by cars in the U.S. every day, and just vertebrate animals, to say nothing of the insects and arachnids. And usually people guess 1,000 or 10,000, but in fact, the real figure is over 1 million animals are killed by cars every day. It's this truly staggering, perpetual death toll. And I think in part because the animals who get killed most often are, as probability would dictate, the relatively common ones like the gray squirrels and raccoons. We take roadkill for granted as a conservation crisis. I think we have this implicit or subconscious mentality that, well, maybe a lot of raccoons and opossums and white-tailed deer are being killed, but those critters are pretty abundant, and they're not going anywhere. But in fact, there are dozens of federally threatened and endangered species, from Florida panthers to tiger salamanders to Hawaiian geese, for which roadkill is really the primary source of mortality. And in fact, as Richard Foreman, the godfather of road ecology, has observed, today traffic is the leading direct human cause of vertebrate mortality, right? Which is just a fancy scientific way of saying there's literally nothing that we do that kills more wild animals than drive. But I think one of the things that makes roadkill so pernicious is the way that it subverts or kind of hijacks evolution, right? You think about the defense mechanisms of so many of our most common beloved critters, from porcupines who bristle their quills to skunks that spray to turtles who withdraw into their shells, right? These are kind of hunker down, stand your ground defense mechanisms that worked really well for thousands of generations against coyotes and wolves and cougars and all kinds of natural predators. But when your predator is an F-150 barreling down I-90 at 70 miles an hour, the worst possible thing you can do is withdraw in your shell and stand your ground, right? So roadkill takes evolutionary history and renders it not only moot but actually maladaptive. I think that's kind of sad to contemplate. So roadkill, again, is the most conspicuous way or the most obvious way that roads and nature interact, but it's really just the tip of the iceberg, right? And road ecology, this field of science that this book's about, looks at all of these different connections between transportation infrastructure and the natural world. Roads are vectors of invasive species spread. So many plants and animals enter ecosystems kind of along a grid, right? Think about dandelions, for example, a European flower that lines roadsides here in the US. This is a shot I took of invasive thistles on an old logging road in Montana, where basically for decades the logging trucks had transported the thistle seeds in the treads of the tires, and then those thistles all bloomed at once, and now there's this kind of eerie linear purple stripe across the landscape. Roads are these zones of erosion, right? I mean, who's the largest road manager in the world? Some of you probably know that it's the US Forest Service. You could go to the moon and most of the way back on Forest Service roads. And the vast majority of those roads are unpaved. They're these old logging roads, especially in Oregon, and they don't get a ton of human traffic, but they still have huge ecological and even geological impacts. You get a big rain event or a snowmelt event, and those dirt roads just turn liquid and bleed sediment into fish-bearing streams and smother amphibian larvae. So just because a road isn't, a densely trafficked interstate doesn't mean it's not having big impacts. Roads are sources of pollution, right? Our cars are constantly bleeding cadmium and zinc and copper and microplastics and all kinds of stuff into the environment. Some of you probably know the whole 6-PPD saga, which is basically that a few years ago, scientists at the University of Washington figured out there's a a chemical in tire particles, an ozone protector, this polysyllabic chemical, 6-ppd, that nobody'd ever heard of, and it was killing coho salmon in the Puget Sound watershed in huge numbers. Was basically responsible for many years of salmon die-offs, and certainly you can imagine that's been happening in Oregon as well. And probably the most common sort of road chemical connection is road salt, right? We add something like 20 million tons of road salt as a de-icing agent to our highways every year, and that road salt runs off into rivers and lakes and streams and turns fresh water increasingly salty, and it also creates these really dangerous situations for wildlife, right? We basically turned our highways into millions of miles of salt licks, and of course animals are drawn to salt licks, right, for the nutrients, and that can create an ecological trap where we're luring animals in and then potentially killing them. I will say that the road salt issue inspired my favorite road sign, which is in Jasper National Park. Every winter you can see signs saying, "Do not let moose lick your car." I'm not sure you could stop a moose from licking your car. I think if a moose wants to lick a car, he's probably going to do it. But that's the kind of crazy, kind of novel ecosystem that roads can create. Roads are also these hellscapes of noise, right? If you're a Western meadowlark who has to sing to attract a mate, but your mate can't hear you over the engines and tires, you fundamentally can't live in that place, right? So roads are a form of habitat loss, or road noise pollution is a form of habitat loss, driving animals away from places they might otherwise want to live, as well as a huge human health impact as well. Road noise elevates our cortisol levels and blood pressures and risks of stroke and cardiac disease and diabetes. It's also one of the great public health problems of all time. I just wanted to show a quick video that I think illustrates this concept of road noise as habitat loss, because it's not necessarily an intuitive concept, but I think this video gets at it pretty well. This is somewhere in British Columbia, I think.
Did you say there's audio to this? Because we can't hear that.
Can't hear it.
Nope. Not sure if that's a Zoom challenge.
All right, let me try it one more time. Let's see if this works. I can hear it on my end. It's going to come in right now. Did you hear it? Did you hear it that time?
I didn't. I'm assuming others did not. But was it a loud noise? Is that what spooked them?
Well, I'll just describe it to you. So so halfway through that video, right, there's this sudden roar of an ATV in the background, and those bears suddenly turn alert and basically flee the scene, chased away by that that auditory stimulus, right? So again, engine vehicle noise is just driving animals out of habitat in our wildest places. But it's not all entirely doom and gloom, right? Roads, yes, they destroy ecosystems and habitat, but they also create ecosystems and habitat in some cases. Animals are kind of endlessly flexible and adaptive and creative, and they're really good at taking advantage of these novel ecosystems we engineer for them. One of the places I visited in working on this book was Minnesota, and we went to this highway overpass, and the underside of the overpass were all of these crevices, and there were hundreds of little brown bats roosting in the crevices, taking advantage of that concrete habitat, living in that novel ecosystem. Another kind of road novel ecosystem connection is our roadsides. Yes, in Oregon and Colorado, we're blessed with lots of public land, but in places like Iowa and Illinois and Kansas, there is not a whole lot of public land, and those roadsides are actually the largest sources of public land. So much of the landscape is corn and soy and lawn monoculture, and those roadsides in some cases are the last strips of native prairie, which monarch butterflies and all kinds of insects utilize very, very happily. But of course, the problem is, in providing this nectar resource along roads, we're also luring animals again into these dangerous situations, right? And millions of migrating butterflies are killed by cars every year. We don't really think about insects as being roadkill, but this is a huge source of mortality for migrating monarchs. So do the benefits of that roadside habitat outweigh the risks of attracting animals to road corridors? That's a big question that scientists are looking at now. Another sort of similar potential ecological trap is with scavengers, right? We've turned our roads into these linear trails of carcasses, and we've all seen ravens and magpies and bald eagles and golden eagles, utilizing that roadside food resource, right? That elk or deer or pronghorn. But again, the problem is, if you're a bald eagle with a belly full of venison, it takes you a minute to achieve liftoff, right? And so you're at risk of becoming roadkill yourself. And in fact, thousands of eagles are killed by cars every year. So again, the road it's a resource, it's an ecosystem, but it's also a profoundly unnatural, dangerous ecosystem as well. And of course, these collisions between vehicles and animals, yes, they're obviously this huge conservation problem that poses an existential threat to many species, but they're also really dangerous for us drivers as well, right? And that danger primarily comes in the form of deer vehicle collisions, DVCs. Often you see that, or WVCs, wildlife vehicle collisions, this larger category of crashes that includes other animals as well. And the data on these incidents isn't great because a lot of them go unreported. But to the best of our knowledge, there are up to 2 million large animal collisions, most of them deer collisions, in the U.S. every year. So that's something like a collision every 30 seconds. There will be many of them while we're having this conversation. The average deer collision these days costs more than $9,000. In Colorado, where I live, they're collectively costing the state more than $80 million. I'd imagine the numbers are similar in Oregon. And that's, all of the different costs associated with these dangerous, expensive crashes, the hospital bills, the vehicle repairs, the insurance costs, the tow trucks, so on, right? So they're collectively costing the United States more than $8 billion every year. And they're also killing up to 400 drivers every year. Deer are the most dangerous wild animal in North America. Obviously, it's not the deer's fault, right? It's the vehicle's fault, or at least automotive society's fault. But I think that's pretty indicative of what a widespread problem this really is. And of course, deer aren't the only large-bodied animal out there. The average elk collision, certainly, an issue that Eastern Oregonians are familiar with, costs society more than $20,000. The average moose collision costs more than $40,000, right? So this is, again, this problem that spans many different species. And historically, the way that transportation departments have tended to deal with this issue is by putting up signs, right? We've all seen a million of these, yellow diamonds with the jumping black buck. And I'll just tell you, empirically what I'm sure you've deduced intuitively, which is that these signs just don't work, right? There are just so many of them that we tend to habituate to them. They're not really put up in any kind of systematic way in most states. And often you see this sort of thing, deer crossing next 30 miles. Well, what driver is going to remain alert for 30 miles, right? Nobody. And yet, because signs are this cheap, visible, public expression of concern, they've become the default solution for DOTs around the country and really around the world. And again, there's really no evidence suggesting that the standard road sign is effective at all. And in fact, I've heard biologists call them litter on sticks, which I think gets at their uselessness nicely. And I'd point out too that even if road signs were effective in preventing animal vehicle collisions, that moment of impact, from wildlife's standpoint, that those collisions are only part of the problem that roads create, right? They're really only half the problem. And the bigger problem in many cases is the loss of habitat connectivity, the ability of animals to move freely around the landscape. Because you can imagine that, on many of our most busily trafficked highways like I-5, traffic volumes are so dense that animals don't attempt to cross the road at all, right? They just pace the roadside looking for a way across, or they bounce off repelled by that wall of traffic, which scientists have called the moving fence. And that loss of the ability to migrate and disperse can actually be, in some cases, a bigger problem, I think, than roadkill itself. And to illustrate that point, one of the places I went working on this book was southwestern Wyoming, to the Red Desert, where there's this famous herd of migratory mule deer who go about 300 miles round trip from their winter range to their summer range. And scientists have put satellite collars on these deer, and so they know where these deer go and hang out. And what they found is that interstate highways are basically a total barrier to deer migration, right? So this is a map of basically where these deer spend the winter. All these purple blobs are the places the deer hang out on the winter range. And this white line across the bottom of the screen is I-80. And what you can see is that those deer basically never cross I-80, right? Because of that, again, constant wall of vehicles. And during harsh winters, they'll pool up against the north side of the highway looking for a way across, not finding one. And some years, 40% of that deer herd will actually starve because they can't access all of that good winter range south of the interstate, right? So, you could imagine, again, a herd of 1,000 mule deer, they can handle a few collisions on the highway. What they can't handle is losing access to all of that great habitat, right? Here's another map that I think illustrates a similar point. These are the movements of a single young male grizzly bear in Montana. And every red X is a place where that bear approached I-90 and bounced off like a ping pong ball, just, again, repelled by that really dense wall of traffic. And that bear actually attempted more than 40 crossings over the course of many months before he finally found his way through, right? So again, a road might only be 100 feet wide from shoulder to shoulder, and yet it's denying animals access to, in this case, hundreds of thousands of acres of habitat. Here's another kind of depressing map. These are mountain lion locations in Southern California, just west of Los Angeles. This is a very famous mountain lion population who lives in the Santa Monica Mountains, and every kind of collection of different colored dots is a place where a different individual mountain lion hangs out. And these red lines are the freeways, the 101, the 405, some of the busiest freeways on Earth. And what you can see very clearly is that those mountain lions essentially never cross those freeways, right? These cats are basically marooned on an island of habitat in this ocean of freeways and development. And as a result, those young dispersing mountain lions can't leave that island of habitats. They often get killed by dominant males. But an even bigger problem is that no new mountain lions can enter the island from the north, right? And so these mountain lions trapped in the Santa Monicas are stuck mating with their own daughters and granddaughters and great-granddaughters. And they've begun to develop genetic defects as they've become increasingly inbred over the years. And they've entered what scientists call an extinction vortex, this kind of long-term doom spiral caused by all of this inbreeding, which is in turn caused by freeways. So we have these kind of two linked problems, right? We have wildlife vehicle collisions on one hand, these crashes featuring animals and cars that we know again are very dangerous for obviously the animals, but also us drivers. And then we have this habitat fragmentation problem, right? The inability of animals to cross freeways and move around the landscape and access the resources they need. So how do we solve, or at least begin to start addressing, these two linked or related problems? And really, the best tool we have at our disposal are wildlife crossings, right? Overpasses, underpasses, culverts, tunnels, all of these different structures that allow animals to safely move back and forth across the landscape. This is an overpass on Highway 93 in Montana, north of Missoula, on Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribal land. So wildlife crossings, this concept of building infrastructure for animals, this really begins in Europe in the 1950s. France was the first country to build wildlife crossings, followed by Germany, Austria, Switzerland, other Western European countries. These days, the Netherlands is the world's leader in this concept. They have the highest sort of density of wildlife crossings per road kilometer in the world. The Dutch, of course, are great at engineering everything. Here's a famous Dutch wildlife overpass. It's a kilometer long, so a little more than half a mile, and it spans two highways, a railroad track, a sports complex, and a business park. So a pretty impressive structure. The place that wildlife crossings really took off, certainly in North America, was in Canada. As many of you know, this is in Banff National Park, which in the 1980s began building first underpasses for deer and elk primarily. But what they realized pretty quickly was that grizzly bears in particular required overpasses. Grizzly bears are these big, powerful, fast animals who want to confront their enemies head on in open space, right? They don't want to crawl through a culvert. They want to be up on the deck of a bridge. And so in the 1990s, Parks Canada built a half dozen of these overpasses, and it took them a few years, but grizzly bears eventually started using them. So there's kind of this cool social learning process that happened in that bear population as gradually the female bears figured it out. The sows taught their cubs. The cubs became crossers. The cubs taught their cubs, and so females and males were both moving back and forth across the highway, mating on either side, and encouraging the kind of genetic interchange that's missing in a place like Southern California. So those Banff wildlife crossings and all of the research that was conducted around them, I think really proved to the world that this was an effective concept. Here in the US, the first wildlife crossings were really built in the 1970s, and they're primarily built in Rocky Mountain states. Wyoming, Colorado, Utah. Those were the three, who built some of the first wildlife crossings. And the reason for that is that those states tend to have big migratory herds of ungulates, right? Mule deer, elk, pronghorn. If you have 1,000 mule deer crossing the same highway in Wyoming every single year, well, pretty soon, unfortunately, there's this big pile of carcasses saying, hey, put the wildlife crossing right here, right? And so, those migratory deer herds and elk herds and antelope that you see in those Rocky Mountain states, those are really kind of the early test cases for wildlife crossings that proved this concept in the US. One of the important lessons that road ecologists figured out pretty quickly is the importance of fencing, right? People always say, well, how do the deer know to use the wildlife crossing? And, the answer is the fences basically funnel them there, right? Those deer are, pacing that fence line, looking for a place to cross safely, and then they see that box culvert or overpass, and there you go. There's your crossing point. So those two elements, the fences and the crossings, really have to work hand in hand. The fences keep the animals off the highway, and the wildlife crossings provide them opportunities to safely move back and forth across the landscape. Another important component to these wildlife crossing systems that you often see on highways in the West and have maybe wondered about are these jump outs, right? These one-way escape ramps. And basically the concept there is that if you're a deer or an elk who somehow does get through the fence, as they occasionally do, and you get trapped in that road corridor, those jump outs are basically one-way escape ramps that allow you to flee that highway corridor and get back on the right side of the fence, right? So all of those pieces work together really effectively. Another important lesson that road ecologists have learned over time is the importance of providing a diversity of crossing opportunities, right? We know that every animal fills a different ecological niche and has different habitat requirements, and likewise they have different wildlife crossing requirements, right? There are animals like grizzly bears or like elk or pronghorn, who prefer going over highways. There are other critters like mountain lions and mule deer, who are fine going under. And there are also lots of smaller animals out there too, who require these habitat features to kind of help them across. So here's an example of that. This is an overpass on I-90 up by Snoqualmie Pass east of Seattle. This is a very famous structure. And here, they built this great overpass primarily for elk, but you can see they also bolted into place all of these log structures, and and those are there for lizards and snakes and rodents and all of these smaller critters who need that cover to scamper back and forth across that overpass. Here's another cool crossing structure from the same stretch of highway on I-90. This is a really nice, big, capacious underpass. And you can see they've actually separated the highway to allow light to hit the forest floor, just creating a more natural feel or vibe. And they've also added this cool line of rocks you can sort of see in the background there, and that's for reptiles and rodents, as well as pikas, which live up there up in the Cascades, and require those talus slopes to move around the landscape. So again, just accommodating every species in some capacity. And another sort of important crossing type that you see up there at the Snoqualmie Pass, and in many places in Oregon as well, are enlarged culverts, right? Culverts are these little narrow pipes that funnel streams under highways, and in many places, transportation departments are enlarging those culverts to provide better crossing opportunities, certainly for fish, as well as for otters and beavers and salamanders and all of those, riparian associated animals, who aren't going to use an overpass, but like having that, that crossing opportunity. So here's just a quick video that I'd love to show you guys from that section of highway on I-90 up on Snoqualmie Pass, just illustrating the diversity of wildlife that uses these structures. So we've got some deer doing their thing. We've got a mountain lion doing their thing. Looks like an elk. There's the cow and calf elk, right? So it's nice to see the juveniles using these structures as well. There's the family of otters using that culvert, right? So that's really cool to see. So again, that's just providing opportunities for all of these different animals to safely move back and forth. So those culverts that I mentioned, those are a really big wildlife crossing opportunity, right? Culverts don't get a lot of love. I think a lot of people don't even know what a culvert is. But here in the U.S., we have something like 2,000 dedicated wildlife crossings and something like 2 million culverts, right? And these are structures that were designed primarily to funnel water, under roadways, but animals have figured out how to use them, and by tweaking and retrofitting them, I think we can make them even more effective and enticing as wildlife crossing. So here's an example of that. This is a culvert on Highway 93 in Montana that gets some use from weasels and bobcats and lots of mesocarnivores. The problem is that in spring, this kind of seasonal wetland basically fills the bottom of that culvert, and those terrestrial mammals don't want to use it. So what the DOT did in this case was they basically installed what's known as a critter shelf, right? This little metal catwalk that runs through the length of that culvert and allows animals to move back and forth across its surface, right? So not every wildlife crossing has to be some giant $10 million overpass. There's a lot we can do by modifying the infrastructure we already have in the landscape to accommodate wildlife. And here's another case study that I think illustrates that point. This is an old box culvert in Virginia under I-64. And this was not, again, this is not a wildlife crossing, right? This was a culvert that was built for the seasonal movement of water. And I think there was a rancher who had some cattle that he ran back and forth through that culvert under the interstate. But, a few years back, the Virginia Department of Transportation said, wait a second, what if we just fenced the roadway on either side of this pre-existing culvert and guide animals to that culvert and basically force them to use it as a wildlife crossing, right? So that's what VDOT did, and the results were fantastic. They saw more than a 90% reduction in animal vehicle collisions, not just deer, but also black bears and foxes and coyotes and all kinds of critters. They saw a fourfold increase in deer usage of that culvert, right? So again, you're just using that fencing to funnel animals, into that culvert. You're forcing them to use it as a wildlife crossing. And I think really importantly, from the DOT's perspective, is that project recouped its own costs in under 2 years, right? So the fencing cost something like $500,000, and it prevented so many of those dangerous, expensive crashes that it paid for itself very quickly. And I think that's an important point about wildlife crossings that's easy to miss, is that yes, they're good wildlife conservation policy, but they're also good economic or fiscal policy, right? One of the objections you hear around wildlife crossings is, wait a second, are we really going to spend, $10 million helping deer and elk cross a highway? And there's always a little bit of sticker shock when you see the price tags of wildlife crossing projects. But, again, we know that these structures and the fences alongside them prevent so many of these dangerous, expensive crashes that they recover their own costs very rapidly. There are lots of case studies out there of wildlife crossings which effectively pay for themselves in under a decade. So, whether you care about public expenditures or conservation or the preservation of large game for hunting, there's a good reason to adopt these technologies. Of course, there's a caveat to that, which is that if you take a strictly cost-benefit focused approach to wildlife mitigation, there are a lot of critters that get left out, right? And that's effectively what's happened here in the U.S. We've built lots of wildlife crossings for deer and elk and the big ungulates that mess your car up when you hit them. But we haven't built a whole lot of crossings for the smaller species out there, which is problematic because we know that especially amphibians are some of the most road endangered animals on Earth. These animals are migrating as well from their upland forest habitat to their wetland breeding habitat, and typically there's a road separating those two habitats. The problem is that nobody's ever totaled their car hitting a northern red-legged frog in Portland, and so we tend not to mitigate for these animals, even though we know they're in many cases existentially threatened by traffic. So we need to take not only a cost-benefit approach and build lots more deer passages, but let's also build some conservation-focused wildlife crossings for those smaller and rarer species as well. And I'll point out that other countries are better than we are about that sort of thing in some ways. You see all kinds of cool, diverse wildlife crossings elsewhere in the world. Here's a very famous one for migrating crabs on Christmas Island. Millions of crabs basically move between the rainforest and the beach to spawn, and they cross roads, and they have a number of these steel bridges that those red crabs use as a crossing. So that's the kind of cool, creative thing that other countries are doing. Another neat thing that you see in places like Australia or Brazil or Costa Rica are canopy crossings, right? We know that roads fragment forests, and that there are lots of animals out there, like this squirrel glider in Australia that are never going to descend to the forest floor to use an underpass. So if you're going to reconnect those fragmented populations, you have to do it at the level of the treetops. And so in other countries, you see these rope bridges and ladders that connect those forest fragments, and animals use those very readily. And here in the U.S., we have plenty of arboreal animals that would use that sort of thing as well. We've got martens and flying squirrels and porcupines, but we haven't really done these sorts of canopy crossings. I think again because we take a relatively cost benefit focused approach to mitigation rather than a conservation focused approach. And this movement of building wildlife crossings to facilitate habitat connectivity, and it's truly a global movement. And there's all kinds of cool, exciting stuff happening in other countries that I think we can learn from. One of the chapters of this book is set in Brazil, which is building wildlife crossings in many places at much faster rates than we are for giant anteaters and tapirs and capybaras and all of the cool tropical fauna they have. Nepal actually has a law requiring wildlife crossings with any new road construction in forested areas, right? That's a more progressive federal law than anything we have on the books. And in India, one of the fantastic things you see is actually the construction of highways on elevated pillars so that the forest floor is open for many miles in either direction. So animals like tigers can just wander back and forth rather than finding these small isolated wildlife crossings. And, I think, again, that's kind of one of the challenges that we're up against, right? Is that, here in the US, we have this relatively old, very permanent road infrastructure that we built, in the mid 20th century before we fully understood its ecological harms. And now we're kind of stuck tweaking and retrofitting around the edges. Whereas countries like India that are building their highway system out now can get it right the first time in a way that we really failed to. That said, we are doing a lot of cool stuff in the U.S. Importantly, the 2021 Infrastructure Act included a $350 million grant program for new wildlife crossings that states and tribes and other entities can apply for. And, Oregon's already tapping into some of that funding. There's also $1 billion for new culverts on anadromous fish-bearing streams. And, Oregon and other coastal states have accessed a lot of that funding as well, right? So we have a lot of funding opportunities, federal funding opportunities for building new wildlife crossings and starting to solve this problem. The issue is that the scale of the solution is so much smaller right now than the scale of the problem. We know that $350 million, maybe that sounds like a lot, but that's basically enough to mitigate every known roadkill hotspot in California with nothing left over for any other state, right? So, yes, we're funding this issue better than we did historically, but we really have a long way to go if we're going to adequately devote resources to solving this problem. So, ultimately, both the challenge and the opportunity before us is to remake our infrastructure to save biodiversity, right? No pressure. We know we're in the middle of this sixth mass extinction event in our planet's history. We're in the middle of this biodiversity crisis, and infrastructure is a key factor in that. As I said at the start of this conversation, there's literally nothing that we do that kills more wild animals than drive, right? So if we're going to save wildlife and biodiversity on this planet, we truly have to confront the impacts of our road system and remake that system to be safer and friendlier to wild animals. And here's just one example of that. I went to Texas a couple of years back, and Texas is home to the final ocelots in the United States. There are around 100 ocelots in South Texas. And roadkill is 40% of ocelot mortality, right? So that's an animal that we are losing right now because it's unable to cross roads safely. And, we need many more underpasses and overpasses for ocelots and wolves and mountain lions and all kinds of other critters. So with that, I'll say thank you all so much. If this conversation just whet your appetite for juicy road ecology content, do have this relatively new book out on the subject. The New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, among many other publications, really liked it. So there's liberals and conservatives uniting over the niche cause of wildlife vehicle collisions and habitat connectivity. And I say that somewhat facetiously, but it really is true that this is a nonpartisan issue. There's something in it for everyone. It's the only environmental cause that I know of that unites the hunting lobby and the humane society, right? There was a recent public opinion poll that found that 85% of Colorado residents where I live support more wildlife crossings. And, you couldn't get 85% of Coloradans to agree that the sky is blue. So, this is truly a widely popular and nonpartisan issue. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's achieving so much social acceptance and uptake right now. So with that, I'll say thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to Rob's presentation and to the questions that follow. So thank you all, and Rob, I'll kick it to you.
Great, thank you, Ben. Yeah, as somebody who is eager for some of that juicy road ecology content, I might get my butt to the bookstore tomorrow.
There you go.
So let me just quick share my screen here. And could somebody just confirm that you could see a slide with some logos and a dog and a lady and some mountains?
You're good.
Yep.
Great. So yeah, thanks again, yeah, for that. That was really interesting. I also really appreciate that you aren't just focused on the problems and pessimism, but also solutions and hope. I think we're all really sick of extreme and catastrophic language, but I think when it comes to what we're doing to biodiversity and the climate, there's really no other word than crisis. I find myself being fatalistic a lot more often than I like to admit, but I'm also still hopeful, and I think that hope and love and determination are the forces that can drive people from that inertia of despair and inaction. So at Oregon Wild, our wildlife program focuses on advocating for healthy populations of all native wildlife. Specifically, we work to combat threats to wildlife like habitat loss, climate change, misinformation, and poaching. And we, which is really to say primarily Danielle, accomplishes this work through public education, engagement, grassroots organizing, policy work, supporting our allies and partners, and when necessary, going to court, litigation. So I think the problems that Ben spoke of are global, but they're also relevant at the local level. And the good news is that the same is true of the solutions. These are big and very real problems, but as we saw with that presentation, there are solutions that are ready to be employed here at home. And for me, home is Northeast Oregon. Specifically, my wife and I have a working farm and bed and breakfast just outside the town of Enterprise in Wallowa County. The place we live is a landscape of superlatives. Within a few miles of us is America's largest intact bunchgrass prairie, North America's deepest river canyon, Oregon's largest protected wilderness, and it's also home to the most intact assemblage of large native wildlife that we have left in the state. And while I'm glad to call it home, I'm acutely aware that it's been home to human communities since time immemorial, and no less than 15,000 years. It's a region that was violently stolen from the Nimipu or Nez Perce tribe, and our farm is actually part of an area that was promised to them by our government as their reservation. And Indigenous people have their own stories to tell, and they feature many of the relations with whom we share this landscape. The Nez Perce tribe in particular has been at the forefront of wolf, lamprey, and salmon recovery in recent years, and we're proud now to be supporting their efforts to restore condors to the place in the bottom photo, whose Indigenous name translates to Canyon of the Condor. Just last week, we stood together with tribes and other partners at the Oregon Supreme Court as we fought to restore fish passage in their homelands and across the state. And I certainly hope that in my lifetime, we're going to work together to successfully recover fisher, lynx, wolverine, freshwater mussels, grizzly bear, salmon, and all the other species that do belong here. I think when people think about Eastern Oregon, a lot of folks really think of it as either the sagebrush sea or dry ponderosa pine forest. And make no mistake, we do have a lot of that here. But the landscape of the Blue Mountains ecoregion, they are incredibly diverse and complex. We also have lush forests full of moss-covered old-growth Doug fir, and within a few miles as the raven flies, you can go from a canyon with prickly pear cactus and rattlesnake to grasslands to wet, mossy or messy forests with Pacific yew, all the way on up to high alpine meadows. All 5 of these photos are taken in Eastern Oregon and show just that incredibly diverse landscape. And when I think of the natural values here, the one that stands out above nearly all others to me is connectivity. We are home to countless headwater streams that connect our forests to the ocean and all the landscapes in between. And the incredible elevational and botanical diversity provides these opportunities for wildlife to find refuge in a changing climate. The ecoregion is also the east-west connection point between the Rocky Mountain ecosystem and the Cascades, Coast Range, and beyond. I think wolves, in particular, wolves like OR7, provided these really dramatic examples of that. And scientists are increasingly talking about this region as one of the best remaining opportunities to create functional climate and biodiversity reserves in the United States. Unfortunately, though, white colonists didn't just try to exterminate and subjugate native people. We also hunted and poisoned many species to extinction and extirpation. We built roads and power line corridors. We mined and we overgrazed livestock. We diverted water to make the dry places green, and we logged and built homes and parking lots and on and on and on. And in today's world, as Ben pointed out, it's hard enough for animals like wolves and wolverine and deer to move freely. So imagine what it is like for a pine marten or a terrestrial mollusk or the frogs or the turtles and all of those other living things with whom we share this place. And again, as Ben pointed out, roads aren't just fragmenting habitat. They also affect hydrology, they pollute, they are vectors for invasive species, poachers, and most of our destructive, unnatural wildfires. And I think, most people I talk to believe that our public lands are protected. But sadly, Oregon has only protected 4% of the state as wilderness, which compares really poorly to states like Washington and California, and even that bastion of green liberalism, Idaho, which has protected more than twice as much as Oregon. Outside of wilderness, public lands are heavily roaded. There are more than twice as many miles of roads on our national forests as there are in the entire U.S. highway system. And if you don't believe me, check out these maps of roads in Northeast Oregon. Those big black tangled messes, those aren't cities, those are roads on our national forests. And making matters worse, Northeast Oregon is home to the only 2 national forests in the country that don't have travel management plans, meaning that outside of wilderness, they're essentially off-road vehicle free-for-alls. And, it's often said when you find yourself in a hole, the first thing you should do is stop digging. And sadly, things, though, aren't getting a lot better. Using terms like the greenwash these industrial logging projects like restoration, the Forest Service and their collaborators are trying to increase the pace and scale of industrial logging projects that only increase fire risk, that compact soils, pollute rivers, destroy habitat, and almost always include road building and fragmentation. The big red blobs in this map show industrial logging projects on public lands here that are in development or have occurred in just the last 10 years. The green shows protected wilderness and unroaded lands. The gray areas are the only unprotected places that haven't been recently logged or aren't currently slated to be. So basically, on our national forest, if trees grow in a place and it's not protected as wilderness, there's a good chance that it's been logged and roaded or that it's about to be. So the next time you hear somebody say, we're not managing our forests, please remember this map. And so to combat that, we spend a lot of time working with our partners and decision makers to get the Forest Service to do the right things in the right places. Led by folks like Doug Hyken, Chandra Legui, John Purcell, and others, we engage in dozens, if not hundreds of projects every year. We try to encourage the Forest Service and other agencies to do good things, to make bad things better. And when necessarily, we fight like hell to stop the worst things that are being proposed. And that does include calling for removing destructive roads and certainly not building new ones in places that we don't already have them. But the timber industry, Forest Service, and their collaborators are putting their foot on the accelerator. So that work that we consider sort of defensive work is incredibly important, and it gives us a fighting chance, but it's just really, it's not enough. Andy Kerr once said, that conservationists can be hell to live with, but they make great ancestors. And thanks to generations of that work, there are still places that remain intact. We hear a lot about what we need to restore, but especially here in the forested parts of Eastern Oregon, there are still a lot of places that are functioning as they have since time immemorial. But most of them are not protected and they're not connected. And with the push for ever more logging coupled with new technologies, even if these places are sacred, they are not safe. In a positive development, though, Oregon recently underwent this exercise to identify the best corridors that remain and that could be restored. But without funding and political will, it's still largely just a mapping exercise. The good thing, from our perspective, is that those maps validated what we thought we already knew. There are places that are still healthy and they're still functioning. They don't need anything more than protection from our arrogance and our destructive impulses. And scientists have identified significant portions of Eastern Oregon that are at the heart of proposals for biodiversity and climate reserves that are going to give us and all our relations a fighting chance in this coming era of climate change. And before I close, I just briefly want to talk about a couple of important efforts in which you can make a meaningful impact right now. Here in my backyard in Eastern Oregon, the Forest Service is rewriting management rules for the forests of the Blue Mountains region that are going to dictate activities for a generation or more. Unfortunately, so far, they have essentially let extractive interests and politicians who are hostile to conservation call the shots. And it's our perspective that rather than double down on more extraction, development, and destruction, it's time to shift to a model based on science, 21st century conservation values, honoring treaty rights, protecting functional landscapes, and creating jobs and economic opportunities through real restoration, like closing roads, building trails, restoring waterways, those overpasses and underpasses, managing natural processes like natural wildfire instead of trying to stop them. And I'd ask you to go to this link and sign our petition. Not only will your message get delivered to decision makers, but it'll also let us know that you care about these issues so that we can tell you about opportunities to get involved as the process continues. It may not be roads, but sort of like culverts, dams can create terrible connectivity issues. And thanks largely to tribes and tribal members who have relied on salmon for millennia, the writing is on the wall that the lower Snake River dams are coming down. But many of these wild fish are only a generation or two from being extinct. So we need you to tell Senators Wyden and Merkley that the time for delay is over. And as a matter of justice for humans and animals alike, it's far past time to breach the lower Snake River dams. And last but not least, though it's been stuck in committee for far too long, we need you to continue to remind Senator Wyden that when it comes to the River Democracy Act, we've got his back. This is an incredible proposal that would give a modest level of protection to over 3,000 miles of rivers across the state. And while it would only bring the percentage of protected waterways in Oregon up to 6%, it's impossible to understate what a historic, or sorry, to overstate, I suppose, what a historic and important step that would be. That was a lot, probably too much, but that's also the reality that we're dealing with. The scale of the threats is huge, so the scale of our work is also enormous. No one of us or one group can do it all, but we can each do our part. And that's why groups like Oregon Wild exist, and why we're so appreciative of people like Ben who are making the case for both the problems that we're facing and the solutions that need to be enacted with the things that need to get done. We've listened, and we're going to continue to do our part, but we really do need your support. So in addition to buying that book, if you want to see a healthier, more connected planet where all living things can thrive, please support groups like ours. Check out our website, donate, attend webinars, and above all, please use your voice. When you see that action alert, click the link. When you read misinformation in your newspaper or a magazine, write a letter to the editor. When your elected official holds a town hall, go. Ask them, why are you dragging your feet on Snake River dams? Why are you being passive about these massive logging and road building proposals in Eastern Oregon? Why aren't we funding these overpasses? Please just don't be silent or passive or resigned. So I think that's more than enough for me. I want to be sure you all get a chance to ask questions of Ben and Danielle. So I'll leave it there. Just thanks again for being here, for listening, and for supporting the values that we all share.
Great. Thanks, you both. That was wonderful. And we do have some questions, and I bet more are coming in. So let's see. Well, and I think, Rob, you answered this, and Ben, you did as well. Somebody just want to know what we can do to mitigate the situation, right? Lawmakers, but which one? So I think, Rob, you had addressed that, especially for Oregon. So this is an interesting one. What is the best way for a driver to approach wildlife on the road? This person said, it drives me nuts to see drivers not slow down and honk their horn at deer as they're continuing driving. So I don't know, Ben, if you have any tips or tricks on if you're observing wildlife on the highway and what to do that's both safe for the driver and for wildlife.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, certainly, slowing down is the best thing you can do. You really want to. I mean, the kind of the mantra of the state trooper is, don't veer for deer, right? Because when you swerve to avoid an animal, unfortunately, that's when you hit another car head on, or hit a tree or a telephone pole or something. So a lot of I think that a lot of, single car crashes, fatal crashes, are probably wildlife avoidance crashes that unfortunately nobody survives to record it as such. So, you just want to slow down for critters, but don't swerve to avoid them. Unfortunately,
Yeah,
it's sort of hard. It's hard to counteract that instinct.
for
And I
sure.
would say just, yeah, like, drive less, drive slower, and pay attention. I mean,
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, and and I mean, it's also it's a hard thing to do, but I'd also say, like, don't drive at night, right? Or
Yeah.
at least minimize night driving. And I mean, I'm guilty of this all the time. I do plenty of driving at night, but obviously that's a window in which your reaction time is really slowed. Animals are moving around. They're also blinded by headlights, which is why you get the deer in the headlight phenomenon, of course. So, insofar as it's possible to minimize night driving, I think that's an important step to take.
Yeah. This person said, glad to see reptile consideration, invertebrates. Just, I think they were curious what maybe specific techniques are used to support reduction of invertebrate fatality.
Yeah, in the U.S., none. But there is a cool there's my favorite example of road mitigation maybe ever is in Taiwan. There's a migration of what are called purple crow butterflies. I think it's the second largest butterfly migration in the world after monarchs, and they'll actually put up these giant nets on either side of the highways during purple crow butterfly migration season to keep the butterflies out of the road corridors. So, try telling Texas to do that. But
Yeah.
that's the sort of another example of really cool international creative thinking that we could learn a lot from.
Yep. They said, this person said, you mentioned India. Is India also focused on building crossing structures?
Yeah, they certainly have done some. It's challenging because they obviously they're a country that's developing very, very rapidly, right? And they're building lots of new highways, and some of those highways are certainly built on those elevated pillars that I showed, at least for some stretches. Some are built with wildlife crossings, but many are not. It's another situation, I think, in which the solution is being implemented, but not necessarily at a pace or scale that keeps up with development. I mean, the other interesting thing about India is that they have, they're building a lot of new rail lines, and obviously rail is that's one of the solutions, right? Anything we need to keep people out of cars is is good, but rail also has lots of wildlife vehicle collision problems. And in India, it's actually Asian elephants who are often hit by rail. They get attracted. Like those rail cars will spill grain, and so the elephants are attracted to the railways. And obviously, trains take a couple miles to break, right? So they can't really stop. And so that's actually the biggest source of mortality for Asian elephants is train collisions right now. And so most of the wildlife crossings that are being built in India, I believe, are actually over rail or over and under rail.
Interesting.
And if I can actually just add, that's an interesting thing. We don't think about that too often, but the same thing does happen out here. I have heard anecdotally that we've got this huge rail line that goes east-west across Northeast Oregon through some really narrow constricting areas, wintering elk habitat. And well, I can't personally confirm it. I've heard from multiple sources that the amount of wildlife those trains are killing is incredible. You can imagine why we don't hear about that, because billions of dollars in traffic, and the trains can just plow right through a herd of elk, but and imagine what else they're hitting. So that's really interesting you say that. Again, so many of these problems, it's easy to say, yeah, we got to go do stuff about the Amazon and the tigers, and we should support that, but a lot of these things are really relevant here at home. So thanks for bringing that up too, Ben.
So one thing that I've actually heard come up, and I think with the increasing intensity of wildfire, is depending on the fencing design, if it's prohibitive for wildlife to be able, while roads obviously are a hazard, but if there's wildfire and they're trying to quickly move. And then there's the fencing that's obviously kind of trying to funnel them, like you said, to the crossing structures. I don't know if you, if your book or if in any of the research have done some analysis on just either maybe how the fencing should be constructed so that there is, some type of like, I don't know, default or, way for them to get around that, in the case of a wildfire. But it's just an interesting consideration because I had the same mindset, like, oh yeah, absolutely, fencing, funnel them, get them up there, and then you think about if they're trying to quickly escape wildfire.
Yeah, it's a good point and question, and I mean, to me, the answer is really just providing as many crossing opportunities as closely spaced as possible, right? I mean, you don't want your fence to be permeable because then they'll get through it, obviously, and get hit by cars. But like what we see in Colorado, unfortunately, along I-70, for example, is you'll just see miles and miles and miles of fencing without any underpasses, because like what does DOT care about? I mean, they care about preventing those crashes, right? They're not, the DOTs they're focused on driver safety. They're not focused on habitat connectivity. And so, I think that's a big problem to me is when you have fencing without crossings and you actually, exacerbate the connectivity issue. And so, just providing as many crossing points as possible. I think that's really the key to, to that wildfire mitigation problem as well.
And I can't help myself but get back on my soapbox and say, and in places where we don't need them, less roads, because we also have places like on our national forests out here where we have multiple miles of road per square mile. We don't need all those roads in the backcountry. And perhaps the question you just asked is not quite as relevant to that, but I would put those two together: less roads and more safe crossings for wildlife for all of those reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't really get into tonight, but a big chunk of this book is about road decommissioning in national forests because as Rob says, that's an enormous problem, and it's also I mean, just because this particular question is about fire. I mean, the vast majority of fire starts in national forests occur along roads, right? Humans are, sort of accidental or intentional arsonists, and roads funnel people into the backcountry. I mean, some of the largest fires in California history, have been sparked by flat tires and the wheels grinding against pavement, and so roads are a huge fire hazard, and I mean, road decommissioning is a fire solution, even though the Forest Service often says it needs roads as fire breaks or for fighting fires. We know that those forest roads are huge ignition sources.
Well, sorry, I'm going to just riff off that a little bit more. And I think another thing is, we talk about what we're doing in our forests. And again, I kind of pointed out that all of these industrial logging projects are being called restoration. Some of them are, but most of them, in my experience, are not. What we can do are, and in those projects, the vast majority of the dollars don't stay in our local communities. They go to timber executives in Lake Oswego and Toronto and Chicago, and other countries for that matter. And when you think about what a restoration opportunity is, if we can decommission those roads, fix the roads, build the overpasses, those are jobs, and those are real jobs, and those are local jobs, and they're good paying jobs. And so when we talk about like, well, if we don't log as much and we don't do all this extractive, what can we replace it with? Those are real jobs in local communities, and we have so much work to do that they can last an awfully long time. And furthermore, they're going to help all of those other benefits to wildlife, to natural ecosystem services, to recreation, and all of those other things. So this is actually, in my mind, so many of these things are win-wins. We just have to get out of those paradigms we're stuck in of more roads, because that's what we've done for the last 150 years.
Yeah. So I'm gonna say this is probably the last question, just given the time. And but yeah, is there any plans for making a crossing over I-5 with over the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument in Southern Oregon? And I think I know the answer to this if you don't.
Yeah,
Ben,
if you do, please, Danielle, jump in there.
I mean, yes, there are plans. They have, for lack of a better word, renderings of what it could or should look like and where, and they've done the research. I think it's just a funding thing, which is, for the big structures is one of the, the major problems to solve is how to fund these. Because as you said, however many, $10 million a pop is quite an undertaking, pun intended. So I recently looked up that I-5 crossing, and again, they have the plans, they're ready to go. It's just a matter of getting funding. And I know at the state legislative level that there have been efforts by several folks to try to have, a crossings and connectivity funding package to, help fund those over the long term, and not just, one here, but have that sustained funding for crossings. And I don't know if that entity is also trying to, access those federal funds you mentioned, Ben. But I know there are other projects that have looked at that, but I think they require some state matching funds. So I think trying to get that lined up as well.
Well, yeah, and that was, I think to the question that somebody asked about, like what can we do as citizens to participate in this issue? I mean, I think that that getting that permanent, dedicated funding source is really important. There are lots of Western states, like including Colorado, where we're going through the exact same thing here, right? Which is that when that Wildlife Crossings pilot program, that big infrastructure act chunk of funding passed, all of these states wanted to access that money, right? And it's basically this match program where states have to bring some of their own funding to the table. So, Oregon and Colorado and other states basically passed, these little one-off bills that basically authorized a single year of matching funds. And now, we're looking at how to make that funding permanent. And, I think in terms of sort of like road ecology or habitat connectivity bills coming down the pipeline that could really use a strong, sort of public push to get through. I mean, a bill that, and you guys know more about where this is at in Oregon than I do, certainly, but, a bill that would take that state funding for wildlife crossings and make it permanent and create this dedicated pool of money that the state would always have to leverage to get some of that federal money. I mean, I think that getting that bill through is, that's going to be key in every Western state that hasn't done it yet.
Mm-hmm. I would also add for folks, and there's going to be possibly a big transportation bill this year at the state legislature. And it probably will include a myriad of things, but that might be an avenue. And Oregon Wild has been, at least in some of those town hall meetings, saying, hey, to that point of like, if you're building new roads, they must include highway crossing structures or whatever. So I think, if you haven't already, maybe track what's happening with that transportation package this year and be an advocate for wildlife in it to make sure that we're not doubling down on harming wildlife as they explore options for funding and all the things. So, well, great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ben and Rob, for your wonderful presentations. And I learned a lot and look forward to you joining us at a future webcast. So thanks, everyone, and have a great night. Thanks, Ben.